The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, you'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
The High Peak series is sponsored by Gainsborough Cycles, 01427 617 752. For all your cycling needs, this is your one-stop shop located at 20 Ropery Road, Gainsborough, or online at gainsboroughcycles.com. There's a link in the description. Gainsborough Cycles, ask for Trevor Halstead. Welcome back to High Peak again, everybody. Now today we're in an area that used to be part of a massive forest. It was called the Royal Forest of High Peak, and two of those words exist in the name of today's village and today's parish. This is Peak Forest. Peak Forest, Hill Woodland. Today in High Peak we come to a village that's got a name used by several landmarks in the area, yet most of them aren't within the actual parish. That's because the woodland from which Peak Forest gets its name extended across a far wider area once upon a time. Mind you, the village would have been at its centre, and it remains so today. Peak Forest is a small village on the A623 between Chapel on the Frith and Chesterfield. It grew from an earlier settlement simply known as Dam, which is still inhabited with a number of houses and farms. Today, Peak Forest contains an inn, a church and a primary school. The massive woodland in question was the Forest of High Peak. It was a royal forest and it was formerly known as the Chamber of Campana. The nearby Chamber Farm or Chamber Knoll may have been the exact location of the residence and meeting place of local forest officials. The village was at its very heart, but because it was so large it covered other areas which aren't part of the modern parish. These include places like Peakdale, which is in neighbouring Wormhill, and that was the southern terminus of the Peak Forest tramway. Further west, the Peak Forest Canal, which connected with the tramway, ran north towards Manchester. Both of those things will be covered across the next few episodes. The church in Peak Forest Village is interesting. Until an Act of Parliament was passed in 1754, its minister was able to perform marriages without the need for reading the banns, leading to Peak Forest's nickname, the Gretna Green of Derbyshire. Let's check it out. Even though Peak Forest Parish is one of the smaller ones in High Peak, at least in terms of population, the area was important royally. The main village was at the heart of a massive woodland known as the Royal Forest of High Peak. It's not hard to see where the name Peak Forest comes from then, right? It covered a much wider area than just the village itself, which retains the name. It encompassed several hamlets and villages, including the tiny settlement of Sparrow Pit, which is where today's adventure will start. Sparrow Pit has nothing to do with birds. Instead, it should be seen as three separate words: Spar, Row, Pit, and it got its title thanks to the many nearby Flurospar mines. It's situated at a crossroads where the main road, the A623, rounds an almost 90-degree bend. From that junction, one minor road takes a different and hillier route to Chapel on the Frith, and another heads for Mamtor and Castleton by way of the Winnets Pass. Fun fact for you, in Sparrow Pit, the watersheds between the rivers that run east into the North Sea and west into the Irish Sea meet here. Sparrow Pit has a couple of features worth talking about. For one, there's a memorial hall, or village hall. This is where the local Women's Institute, which was founded in 1977, meet on the third Tuesday of every month. As interesting as this building is, it's the one in front of it that has more of a backstory. On that sharp bend in the A623 is the olive tree. Now, a lot of locals don't call this the olive tree, and the older generations refuse to recognise its modern name. To them both, this is still the Wanted Inn. It was built as a farmstead in 1618 by the Earl of Devonshire, who at that time occupied Chatsworth House. This building is the very reason why Sparrow Pit is called Sparrow Pit. It was originally, according to 17th century records, named Sparrow Pit House in reference to those Flurospar mines. In 1700, the farmstead became an inn and its name was changed to the Three Tuns. In 1839, the name of the inn was changed again to the Devonshire Arms, reflecting its connection to the earldom. When the 10th Duke of Devonshire died in 1950, his second son put the inn up for auction thanks to some rather extortionate death duties. However, nobody bid for it, and so it remained unwanted. That was until 1956, when it was purchased by a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Buswell. Because it finally had an owner, it went from being unwanted to wanted, and hence the name of the pub came along. Oh, and by the way, the A623 is an ancient saltway route which began in Cheshire and ended in Sheffield. That fact will become more important later. Nonconformism, as we know, was a big thing out here in Derbyshire. Methodists have been worshipping at Sparrow Pit since 1738. They still hold regular services on the third Sunday of every month at this building, Sparrow Pit Methodist Church, which was built in 1892. The current Methodist Society dates back to 1839. Okay, so Sparrow Pit is just one of the small hamlets that are in and around Peak Forest Parish. There's another one called Smalldale, which is where we're going to be ending this episode. But for now, we're going to hop into the car and head to Peak Forest Village itself. Now, this place has got a very interesting nickname and a connection to a very well-known village in Scotland. Now we've got a bit of a drive between Sparrow Pit and Peak Forest Village itself. I'm going to use this time to fill in a bit more history about the woodland which gives the village and the parish its name. The Forest of High Peak was, in medieval times, a moorland forest covering most of the northwest of Derbyshire, extending as far south as Tideswell and Buxton. In Norman times, it was a royal hunting reserve administered by William Peveril, who was based at Peveril Castle in Castleton. The forest was bounded by the River Goyt to the west, the River Wye to the south, the River Derwent to the east, and the River Ethrow to the north. In all, it covered about 100 square miles. It wasn't a small forest by any stretch of the imagination. The southwestern area between the Wye and Kinder Scout was relatively open country. That was enclosed by a low wall sufficient to keep out cattle and sheep, but it still allowed deer to roam. The area was known as Campana, and today the Edale Cross marks the point where it meets Hopedale and Longdendale. Records document that deer, wild pigs, wolves, horses and sheep were all present in the forest. Anyone caught breaking forest law, which we last mentioned back in Sherwood, was taken to the castle at Castleton. Despite that, Castleton was never at the centre of the forest. Peak Forest Village itself was. It was formerly known as the Chamber of Campana. Today, this name lives on thanks to Chamber Farm and Chamber Knoll, both of which hold claims to be the exact location of forest official meeting places and residences. Our first stop in Peak Forest Village is this graveyard, which belongs to a Methodist chapel. The graveyard is open to the public, but the chapel, unlike the one at Sparrow Pit, is not. This is the building. A Methodist society in Peak Forest seems to have existed since 1828. As it grew in numbers, it needed a building to house the congregation. In 1852, a chapel was completed, and that building still forms the core of this today. Now, of course, it's a private residence called Wesley House. In 1895, the chapel was enlarged and a schoolroom was added. Further extensions took place in 1932. It remained a Wesleyan Methodist church until 1933, originally in the Bradwell Wesleyan Circuit. Now we're heading north and into the small hamlet of Old Dam, which is essentially part of Peak Forest Village these days. Old Dam, which is alternatively known simply as Dam, is the oldest part of the village and was where the first settlers out here lived. It literally once had a dam, hence the name. Records going back to 1405 prove that fact. The rest of Peak Forest developed along the A623. Historically, the local community was reliant on agriculture, lead mining and limestone quarrying, the latter two industries peaking during the 18th and 19th centuries. Their presence saw the village population reach 500 residents. However, this declined when the lead mines closed and agriculture became the main income source once more. It's pretty obvious to see that now, what with the lush open green fields that surround the place. This next part of the walk takes us across some of those as we make for the main road. Okay, so we can form a loop around Peak Forest by using a couple of footpaths. I'm on the first one of those right now. It was a bit of a difficult one to find, but once I've got foot on a footpath, I'm dead straight to the end. That's usually the way forward. Now, what this will do is it'll take us down to the main street and back to the A623. And most of Peak Forest's landmarks are based on that main street, including the church, and there's a pub as well. The A623 is the focal point of the settlement because it has the church, a school and a pub called the Devonshire Arms. In essence, the centre of Peak Forest moved away from Old Dam when the A623 became a turnpike, vitally important for travellers and trade between Sheffield and Cheshire. See, I said that would become important, now didn't I? That's quite the experience actually. I had to dodge my way around a horse in one field there, which was yeah, interesting to say the least. I had to dodge some stuff on the floor too. I'm not going to draw you diagrams to what that was. Anyway, we're now back on the A623 and we have a pub to look at. That is the Devonshire Arms. Because the Devonshire Arms sits on a former turnpike, what do you think this was originally? Yes, it was a coaching inn. It was built in the 16th century of traditional Derbyshire stone. The name is pretty easy to understand. Unlike the Wanted Inn, there's no convoluted backstory to this one. The pub is a friendly, independent free house with a traditional exterior and two interior rooms separated by a central bar. The decor and layout of tables and chairs is more like a cafe or restaurant. It's a nice pub, this. Almost next door is the local school. Now, I couldn't find out a lot about this one, but I did get that it's part of something called the Woodland Federation of Peak District Schools. That includes 3 schools that come together for learning on Mondays and Fridays. church here has a pretty big link to the Devonshires. The original church was built towards the end of the Civil War by Christiana, Dowager Countess of Devonshire, in 1657. Today it's dedicated to Charles, King and Martyr, who we alternatively know as Charles I. This isn't the building that stood here in the 1600s. It was replaced in 1878 as a gift from the Duke of Devonshire. Now, it's a nice church and all that, but people know this one for one specific reason. Because it stood on royal forest land, it was a peculiar, meaning it was free from episcopal jurisdiction. That enabled couples to be married here without the reading of the banns at any hour of the day or night. You can imagine that this attracted hundreds of eloping lovers to Peak Forest during the first half of the 18th century. It was England's answer to Scotland's famous wedding spot, Gretna Green, where there was a similar setup. The Scottish village might be more well known, but that didn't stop Peak Forest from obtaining the nickname the Gretna Green of Derbyshire. As to who was actually married here, well, that's a little hard to determine. Only the names of the couples are recorded in the special foreign marriages registers, which doesn't tell you a lot. The practice was brought to an end anyway in 1804 by an Act of Parliament. Lastly, we have the reading room, which was established in around 1880. The Duke of Devonshire gifted it to the village in the early 1950s. It's a Grade 2 listed building nowadays. The gable facing the road has a tall Venetian window that was originally part of a 17th century chapel located on the site of the present church. The reading room is a registered charity and run completely on a voluntary basis. Internally, it's not in fantastic nick at the moment, according to my sources, but any refurbishment would be really expensive, purely because Peak Forest lies within a national park and this is a listed building. Those two things make any work more expensive to carry out. At present, its team of volunteers are trying to obtain funding to upgrade the interior. They anticipate costs of at least £100,000, so sorting this out is not a small job. Okay, we are almost done with the main village. We've got a parish notice board here though, and you know what that means, people? One of these cards is going on the board. There we go. Peak Forest is almost done. We're not quite done with this place just yet though, because now we need to take a drive again and head towards a place called Smalldale, and that has something rather large next to it. Okay, so now we're slightly to the south of Peak Forest Village and we're heading for Smalldale, which is down that road there. I'm going to drive through that in a moment, and it will take us closer to the thing you can see in the distance from the summit of this small hill. Over there is the massive Dove Holes Quarry, which is just one of the many limestone quarries around Buxton. Let's go. Peak Forest Parish has another small hamlet within its boundaries, and the word small is doing a lot of work in that statement. That's because the name of the hamlet is Smalldale. As a settlement, this isn't all that exciting. It has about 20 or 30 houses, and it once had a pub called the Bowling Green Inn. Its history can be traced back to Roman times when it developed alongside Batham Gate, which we've met a few times before out here. In much more recent times, Smalldale has been important for another reason: quarrying. That leads us to the massive Dove Holes Quarry, which out here is practically unmissable. Dove Holes Quarry is one of the biggest of its kind in the East Midlands. Its sheer size belies its humble beginnings. It started life as Holderness Quarry, which was far smaller and was developed to replace an earlier quarry just to the west. For over 2 centuries, it's extracted limestone, and it continues to do so to this day. Holderness Quarry was served by the Peak Forest Tramway, an early horse and gravity-powered industrial railway system which opened in 1796, predating the quarry by some margin. It remained in operation until the 1920s, but much of the route and the structures associated with the line remain. The western section of the line is now the route of the Peak Forest Tramway Trail. The tramway was originally planned to be about 4 miles long from Chapel Milton to Doveholes. However, it ended up being 6 miles long, and at its northern end it joined up with the Peak Forest Canal, which ran towards Manchester. That wasn't the original plan though. The canal was originally designed to stretch all the way to Doveholes, but never reached any nearer than Buxworth. Instead, the tramway was constructed in the late 18th century to connect the canal with the quarries. The main purpose of both was to carry limestone to the northwest, and that's where most of the stuff still goes now. Doveholes was by no means the only quarry around here. Limestone quarries are all over this area. This area of the White Peak is sometimes known as the Derbyshire Dome, a reference to the limestone plateau on which these quarries are sited. This limestone outcrop is surrounded by a horseshoe-shaped formation of younger sandstones and shales. The town of Buxton is at the western edge of the limestone region. The lime industry was important for its development, but also for other major settlements further afield. Grinlow was the main location in Buxton for the early lime industry and was licensed for lime burning from 1662 by the 1st Duke of Devonshire. Lime burning also took place at Doveholes from around 1650 onwards. Now, because limestone is in such great abundance here, we haven't heard the last of these limestone quarries. Tomorrow we've got another one to discuss. Join me there everyone, where we'll learn more about it, and also a man called James Brindley too. Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.